We might start getting the show on the road. I know that people will be trickling in from court and work and various other things, but I also know people are joining us online. So I think we should try to keep some semblance of the right start time. My name is Aoife Nolan. I'm together with the other co-lead of the Children's Rights Group, Shushin Liu. I'm delighted to welcome you all here on behalf of the Doughty Street Chambers Children's Rights Group. And as many of you will know, because it's lovely to have so many familiar faces, and also new faces, the group here at the Children's Rights Group here at Doughty Street brings together barristers from across all of the practice teams to focus on innovative legal advocacy aimed at securing the rights set out in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And of course, we're very aware that many of our guests today do that work, are doing similar work from legal practice, from a civil society advocacy, and of course from an academic perspective. And it's wonderful to have you here. And we very much look forward to you sharing your insights throughout the exchange of this evening. And Doughty Street Chambers offers extensive expertise across numerous child rights related areas. The barristers here have experience in bringing groundbreaking litigation for and concerning children in public law, extradition, immigration, mental health, community care, prison law, trafficking, education, child justice, clinical negligence, inquests. The list of happy situations go on, right? But crucially, with Doughty Street, our practitioners have a very strong focus, not just on the domestic, but also on the use of international mechanisms to push forward children's rights. So there's important cases have been brought by colleagues to the European Court of Human Rights, the CJEU, the International Criminal Court, for UN treaty bodies, a whole range. And we're very, very focused on, taking international children's rights and making them local in terms of their, practice and implementation domestically, but we are no strangers to making use of international mechanisms to push forward progress at the domestic level also. Our flagship event every year is our annual lecture, and we are absolutely thrilled. Sorry, I was like, where has Sonia gone? This is a poor beginning, Sonia. We are absolutely thrilled this year that the Children's Rights Group annual lecture is being delivered by Professor Sonia Livingstone, who will be speaking on children's rights apply online as offline, or do they? Emerging challenges in implementing children's rights in the digital environment. And I mean, you spend about 10 seconds reading Sonia's bio and you realize that there is no one better placed to speak on this topic. I mean, her many, many qualifications and honors, from a DPhil to an OBE, to an FBA, to an FPPS, to, Sonia is incredibly well qualified across a range of areas. She's a professor in the Department of Media and Communications at the London School of Economics and Political Science. And I flag that because Sonia is not a lawyer, okay? So when Sonia gives her lecture, it isn't going to be on the day-to-day of, none of us were expecting Sonia to deal with the day-to-day of, litigation and, the most groundbreaking recent decision at kind of the district court level. But what she has is she has this extraordinary background in work on children's rights and digital rights. She's published 21 books on media audiences, children and young people's risks and opportunities, media literacy, and rights in the digital environment. And in particular, I want to flag the really groundbreaking Parenting for a Digital Future, how hopes and fears about technology shape children's lives. She was involved, she founded the EC-funded 33-country EU Kids Online Research Network and Global Kids Online with UNICEF. She has provided advice to the Council of Europe, the European Commission, the European Parliament, the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, OECD, everyone, right? And that is a recognition of her outstanding, exceptional knowledge of the area. And she's currently leading a project, which I think she'll speak about today, on digital futures for children, a centre that is based at LSE. And she works in doing so with the Five Rights Foundation. Now, in addition to having the wonderful experience and expertise of Sonia, we are also extremely lucky because Sonia is going to be joined by Nicole, who is sitting at the front quietly at the moment, Stoilova, who will share a youth perspective on the issues raised in the lecture. So there will be a conversational element to the lecture, which we're delighted about. And thank you so much, Nicole. In terms of what we're going to do this evening, Sonia is going to speak for about 35 to 40 minutes with a brutal cutoff at 40 minutes. And we will then turn to another highlight of the event, which is our expert panel. Okay, and you will see that as part of the annual lecture, we always bring together not just a fantastic lecturer, but also a range of people who can really engage with and respond to what's been said and build on that, drawing from their own expertise and experience. So thank you so much, and we'll introduce them later. They'll all speak for about 5 to 6 minutes each, and then we will turn to a Q&A. Okay, so it's going to be, so we will have all our questions, but we're hoping it'll be more of a conversation than a, question, answer, question, answer. But, that's down to you. Anyway, let me leave it there. Please join me in welcoming and thanking Sonia for being prepared to give this year's lecture.
Thank you so much, Aoife, for inviting me to speak today. This is a great honour, and I'm very excited to talk to you about the work that we're doing and debate some of the challenges about children's rights, specifically in relation to the digital environment. And I will start with, Aoife must have asked me for a title, and I thought, well, a question is going to get people thinking. But actually, the emerging challenges, the many challenges are emerging as we take a child rights framework and think about how it works in their digital environment. I think we've moved past certain debates. The digital no longer seems optional. We've stopped, I think, talking a bit about it as somehow virtual, as if it's not real. We're beginning to grasp how kind of systemically it is the digital is structuring our lives in so many ways. So many of the problems that a child rights framework has long addressed are now kind of in some way touched by or affected by or maybe alleviated by the fact that there is also digital technology kind of connecting us all. And I'm intrigued by both applying child rights concepts kind of in relation to the digital environment and also thinking maybe whether a child right lens can somehow change the digital environment or improve it. And that's something I know that the panel will want to discuss later. So I'm going to talk about the work that we're doing at Digital Futures for Children Centre, which is based at LSE joint with Five Rights. And I'm going to talk for a little while to kind of set the scene. And then I'm going to invite Nicole to come and we're going to have a bit of a conversation. And then I'm going to tell you a bit more. But I have to begin, sadly, where Aoife asked me not to, with the bad news. Because I think the bad news is on everyone's mind and there's kind of no way of ignoring it. So to talk about children's rights when there is kind of crisis of geopolitical crisis at the UN, a crisis with the SDGs, a crisis of legitimacy and authority, a kind of breakdown in solidarity. I might be stating it too strongly, but it feels like a really difficult time for human rights and for children's rights. And I know that many of the organizations, especially the civil society bodies that have been working in this space, are kind of really challenged even to find the funding to continue their work. And this is somehow kind of really intriguingly linked with the digital. So it's sort of accidental, but it's not accidental that it is some of the big tech bros who are kind of calling the shots on this. And so I've mixed up my bad news, both about rights and also about a kind of rolling back of the settlement that many of us have worked very hard over the last few years or even decades to kind of establish in thinking about a multi-stakeholder space that includes the tech industry as it has been expanding and building its offer, including transforming children's lives. And then suddenly, even just in the last few months, we have a whole series of kind of, the trust and safety teams are being sacked, the fact checkers are being stopped. The challenges to, for example, the Digital Services Act in Europe or the Online Safety Act here, the challenges are coming from quite kind of surprising places. Free speech challenge or all kinds of, so it feels a very weird moment to be having this conversation. And at the same time, in every politician's kind of backyard, there are parents mobilizing, saying, we want to ban it. We want to stop it. The Smartphone-Free Childhood campaign today on the news said we've just reached 100,000 signatories, I think. People want something done. So people want something done about the way in which technology is affecting children's lives and giving rise to a whole host of harm. And there's a lot of frustration, just as the tools and resources by which we might have made some transformation seem to be slipping through our fingers. So I begin with bad news. There we go. And what's interesting is that from the parent side and the kind of protest side, also, it's not like they're kind of calling for a child rights approach. It also seems quite problematic. So we might talk a little bit about the call for bans, banning smartphones, banning social media. Sometimes I fear banning children. But it doesn't feel like a rights respecting discussion that is, but a kind of a cry of despair. So we can, I give you three not quite random books. There are many book covers I could capture, but that we can see this moment in a longer history, and maybe it will help to stand back a little bit. I was very influenced by Samuel Moyn's book, The Last Utopia. I don't know how many people read it, about the kind of the rise of the human rights turn in the 1970s, and the moment when the world, if it's not too grand to say, began kind of really talking about, okay, I see the skepticism, talking about a kind of a human rights moment. So if that was the human rights turn, perhaps this is the turn away from, perhaps I'm over reading it, and in the next few years things will change again. It was nonetheless, as we all know, as kind of in the moment of that turn, that the effort to formulate and agree upon the Convention on the Rights of the Child was created. And I'm assuming people have read Anna Holzscheitzer's book, which tells just a fantastic kind of blow-by-blow discursive struggle to get the convention formed and agreed in the frame. And it's always fascinating to see that Article 12 was the kind of the controversial point of debate. Do we really need to hear from children and young people? But Joshua Childish's book is more recent, but he captures something for me in today's dark times or difficult moment, about the kind of very peculiar moment when we have the right-wing populists on one side and what he calls the leftist purists on the other, all attacking a kind of vision that what we want, and I don't speak for you, what many have wanted though, is a sense of limits on political power and respect for individual rights. And he's kind of looking for, where is that fight back in the middle to kind of push back on both sides. And Julie Cohen from Georgetown Law just wrote actually this week that this is the moment when the tech oligarchs, who have been on the rise for a while, have kind of seemed to have visibly moved from seeking personal enrichment to, as she says it, seeking to reconfigure the state and its constituent institutions in ways that are more amenable to oligarchic direction. So it's kind of a really, so it does feel a little bit like a big moment. So as I was just saying to some folk, last week I was at RightsCon in Taiwan, also interesting kind of human rights space. And 3,000 delegates from 155 countries were trying to kind of wake up to 2025's news and find a way of debating, okay, where are the kind of directions of action? What are the possible kinds of solidarity that could be found or rebuilt? Is it plausible to kind of build something from civil society that, given that there's a bit of a vacuum or challenge coming from both state and industry? And even there, surrounded by people who are totally committed to advancing human rights in relation to technology, there is a kind of ambivalence about the position of children and the argument for children's rights that I just kind of wanted to note. And solidarity, even, well, you probably know, but solidarity within the human rights world can be challenging. So, you know, there is an argument that those who advocate children's rights in the larger space can be seen as, or may be, a Trojan horse for censorship, or for undermining privacy as efforts are made to protect children from age inappropriate content. The question of age verification, I think, may come up given expertise on the panel. I think that solidarity is particularly hard to find when it comes to regulation. So everyone is going to agree that we need better digital literacy education in schools, and we need better support for parents. But taking the steps to make the digital world legible so that we can teach digital literacy in school, that's harder. Taking the steps to kind of relieve the burden on parents by putting some of it in the regulatory domain, that's also hard to find. And I'm hearing, maybe this is your everyday experience, I'm hearing a whole kind of series of misunderstandings about children's rights, especially in relation to digital. So perhaps, so one is that the idea is that rights really only means protection. Children's rights means protection, forget the rest of the convention. Oh, though this week I heard the alternative, which is that what we want is child protection, and then there are children's rights. So rights are kind of everything but protection. They're the nice to have somehow. The positive rights, a luxury once we've dealt with protection. And one of the things that I think many of us find, certainly in relation to the digital domain, is kind of trying to keep both the participation and the protection all together, as it were, on the same page. I have even been in meetings in the last few months of human rights and child rights folk talking about what we're going to do about the digital, and we've been advised might be better if you don't use the word rights if you want to get some funding or some visibility, and actually might be better if you don't use the word children, because you know, people don't want to hear about them either, and young people covers a lot of people that we understand. So funders don't like it. I don't know. So I think there's some kind of peculiar. It is a very peculiar moment, and one thing that we've been doing in our centre is noting some of the ways in which children's rights are also kind of being weaponized against children by big tech. So I just wanted to give you one example of that. I'm hoping my writing is not too, so I'm going to be talking a fair bit about what you left out of my biography, if I may say, is the thing of which I'm most proud, which is working with the drafting committee, the drafting group for General Comment 25 on how children's rights apply in the digital environment. And I'm going to talk quite a bit about General Comment 25. So General Comment 25 kind of more or less follows the structure of the convention and says, I think, something fairly uncontroversial about the best interests of the child being dynamic and requiring contextual assessment and so forth, and is now being embedded. And one of the things that I think is super interesting is that what we're finding is that pieces of legislation that don't want to mention children's rights, because that seems political, seem happy to mention the best interests of the child. And so it's a kind of a way of shoehorning in, or maybe opening up a space for a wider. So the data protection in Britain there mentions the best interests of the child as the first standard of the Age Appropriate Design Code, as I'm sure you know. It's there in the Digital Services Act. We've been kind of tracing, and Five Rights, who's originated the code, have been kind of looking for where it's popping up here and there. But then it becomes, of course, the focus of contestation And so we've been thinking what it means when Meta says, okay, so best interests is an important concept, so we will have a best interests of the child framework. And Meta offers its framework, and its framework is kind of about providing parental controls and giving guidance to parents and doing what it thinks the best interest of the child might mean in its own conception or its own politics. And especially, we've been watching the way in which Net Choice, which is a trade association of all the big tech companies, has been attacking specifically the concept of best interests of the child as its way of contributing to striking down the various efforts across the US states to introduce both privacy and safety. So here's Net Choice attacking the California Age Appropriate Design Code Act, saying among its many infirmities is the inherently subjective concept of best interests of the child, which is going to cost us a lot of money if we guess wrongly what that might mean. And so this is a copy of our report where we kind of trace this, but I use it really as an example, and there are probably others, of some of the ways in which child rights concepts that you might say, fantastic, we've got it into the data protection regulation, we've got it into the Digital Services Act, actually, no, then it becomes, kind of comes back to bite you. So what does good look like? This is what good looks like. I thought I would just say, and this is very familiar to you, I know. I would thought I'd just kind of rehearse what is it I say when I go and talk to big tech or regulators who haven't really thought about children's rights, like why a child rights approach? You might have a sixth, and every time anyone says they've got 5 points, I know a smart bunch of people is going to come up with a sixth. Okay, so why then talk? And we were actually talking today at a meeting when someone was saying what we need are ethical approaches to the digital world, or we need values-based approaches to the digital world. And when I said no, I think what we need is a rights-based approach, you could see the kind of uncertainty, like what does it mean? So I think we're talking to a number of new audiences as we take child rights into the digital environment. So my 5 points. One, it's holistic, which is why I have to put up all the articles all at once, and insists on the whole child and the whole array of rights, and you can't start trading them off. And I think that is just very, what I hear in relation to the digital is the Department of Education does this bit, and the Department of Business does that bit, and the Department of Health is doing something else, and they all like take a bit, and then they fail to anticipate that they're going to contradict each other, or risk will arise in the middle. So holistic seems important. Authoritative seems important. So I realize the authority of the UN is a little contested, but nonetheless, unlike a values-based approach or unlike an ethical approach, a rights-based approach has the authority precisely of being kind of embedded in the law in various ways, with designated actors responsible for doing something about it. And there are all kinds of actors now who are trying absolutely to kind of promote children's rights in relation to the digital environment. Okay, number 3 is that it's child-centered, and I really mean child-centered, not child-centric, but not adultist. I don't know what you think of John Wall's kind of call for action that we should think about childism, like feminism, and counter adultism as a kind of ideology. I think he's making a provocative case there, but child-centered seems obvious to those who care about children's rights, but not obvious to most people out there who are dealing with big tech. Grounded in evidence, you would expect me to say that, wouldn't you? We've been actually thinking hard about where the evidence fits and supports, and how to make the evidence speak to especially General Comment 25 and the kind of many claims it makes from what is known of children's digital lives to what should happen to improve children's digital lives. How do we kind of, but it does kind of call for and is very focused on evidence base. And my last one is actionable. And I think also, you know, that kind of repertoire of tools from child rights impact assessments or child rights due diligence or the Children's Global Digital Compact, you know, a whole set of kind of actionable tools. So I think, so I've been thinking a lot, and I know my colleagues were thinking together about how do we take the kind of the advantage of the child right lens into thinking about the digital environment, into spaces where a lot of people have not really thought about rights or children and maybe don't even want to. And I should just briefly say something about digital. That's no easier than, in fact, that's a moving target. And I think that's the challenge. And I know a lot of people thinking about digital are already kind of rethinking much of what they've said, because this is the AI moment, and suddenly the AI moment seems to be kind of overwriting much of what's gone before. But Amanda Third, who I work with in relation to child consultations, has kind of set out three ways of thinking about digital, and I do think we confuse them. And we need to somehow be holistic there too. So one is digital media or technologies as tools, as devices, things we could give children or ban them from, or contents or services. One is something about digital spaces, environments, places where we spend our time, maybe extending the possibilities for action or putting at risk the possibilities for action. And the third is digital infrastructure. And that absolutely came to my mind this morning when the Prime Minister announced automating the civil service. That sense that we are kind of building a digital infrastructure under everything we do, including what previously was private or public or intimate or just kind of uncharted, and suddenly is all those were my kind of some of the things I wanted to say. I've got so at the Digital Futures for Children Centre, I was just saying I need a picture of all the people. We're a small team, but we're quite a dynamic team when we kind of reach out through consultants. We've been trying to take specifically that lens, those kinds of principles of holism and authority and child-centered and so forth, to think about the challenges that many people are discussing in relation to the digital world, but not through a child rights lens. And so I could just point to some of the papers we've recently written and some of the reports which are kind of on topics that people might feel familiar. And the question is, what does a child right lens bring to them? So a lot of debate about age verification. What does it look like through a child rights lens? A lot of debate about parental controls. Are they the solution? What do they look like through a child rights lens? A lot of discussion about children's gaming online. In fact, an enormous research literature and area of kind of advocacy and practice. What are the child rights issues there? EdTech is another one that I suspect our panel might want to talk about. Children's safety from harm. So one of our recent reports was about technology facilitated child sexual exploitation and abuse. And again, we were kind of trying to think, what does a child rights lens look like there? So I'm not going to elaborate any of those projects because they might each take my 35 minutes. And Aoife has promised me she's a dragon with her watch. So I'm going to, at this point, say that one of the things that, of course, a child right lens on any of these projects does, or any of these topics does, is consult young people. And in our work, we've been doing that actually in a range of ways, but one is fortunately working with the Five Rights Foundation. They have recently constructed a global youth ambassadors program. So they now work with several hundred young people from many different countries. And we've been delighted to consult them about artificial intelligence and about future digital futures and many other topics. But I can't bring all that into the room today, but I can invite one young person to come up and join me and say something. And so I'm very pleased to ask Nicole Stoilova to come and talk to me a little bit about some of the things. So welcome, Nicole. And we met last week. Sorry, we've met before, and we have consulted. I've often consulted Nicole about our research, but we did sit down last week and talk a little bit about what we might say today, because this is not your obvious child-friendly space, if I may say so. It could do with a bit of a redesign if you're going to make a habit of these meetings, but it's fine. Nicole, would you like to just introduce yourself and say, yeah.
Hello, I'm Nicole. I take biology, chemistry, maths and psychology, and I'm very honoured to be here to speak as a young person and say my opinion on stuff that is about young people.
Fantastic. Do you want to say how old you are?
Oh, I'm 17.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. And we talked about a lot of things last week, but one of them for me was super interesting. I thought we might start with was you helped me understand something of the appeal of TikTok. And you talked about TikTok kind of by comparison with Instagram as something that seemed like a good thing.
Yes, I prefer TikTok over Instagram because I think it's more moderated and it's also more personalized to what I like to watch. There's a lot more button like not interested, so I can get rid of videos that I don't like watching. And Instagram's a bit more unfiltered and just shows you what they want. But I prefer TikTok, yes.
Yeah, I was really interested, partly because I don't use TikTok, so it was like that classic thing of the adult who is studying something she doesn't really have experience with. And also because of what you said, like the idea of it being personalized to you. And yeah, and one of the things I was then trying to work out was, so what do you share with your friends? If everyone's watching their own personalized feed, how do you talk about anything online with your friends?
So even though it's personalized, it's very easy to just send it to your friends. And also if something blows up, which is a video going viral, and it also comes up on pretty much everyone's For You page, so everyone seems to see it, but that's the more popular TikToks. But other than that, all the other videos are personalized, but it's very easy to share them with your friends.
That was another moment for me when I realized I didn't know what it meant for something to blow up, but I know, well, you know, I'm learning. I'm learning, but also it really, I think what you said there really helped me understand that there are all kinds of things you engage with, but it takes something really going viral to create the common conversation. And that's kind of then what adults look in and see, and they say, oh, you're all watching that really weird thing that went viral. But that, yeah. And then the other thing I was really, as in my last TikTok question, but I know there was quite a lot of talk among people about young people getting their news from TikTok, and there's sometimes some quite kind of patronizing views that means you're just watching news about celebrities, or so I don't know, which might be interesting actually. But anyway, but tell me something about news on TikTok.
I know hearing that children get news from TikTok may seem scary and that it doesn't really matter, but accounts like BBC News and Sky News, they've sort of known that TikTok is a very used platform, so they also post important things on TikTok. So it's not just celebrities, it's everything that's happening in your everyday life. And it does come up and people do watch it because it is something that also concerns us. It's just that being also posted on TikTok makes it more convenient for us to watch, and I think that actually makes us watch the news more than we would have without it being posted on TikTok. So, yeah.
Thank you. Which is really important to remember when people are sort of saying, well, you know, why should young people be on social media? There's so many risks. Let's just stop it. But then, like you say, there are some real benefits. And on the risks, could you say something about which ones young people you think are most talking about, most concerned about?
I think
Or maybe
sorry.
many, I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the things that we fear most when being online is seeing horrible images or videos, or also reading nasty comments, but that's pretty much the main issues that are
Mhm.
considered.
The comments is interesting. So who's putting the comments there?
It depends whoever's using TikTok or
Yeah.
that platform. It is other users, could be adults, could be children, but yeah, it is people.
Yeah, people. And when you see the horrible content or the horrible comments, do you think there should be some help and support? Do you think young people, children should be left to kind of deal with it on their own, or
Yeah, I
who
think
should?
companies do sort of help with that. I think it does depend on the platform. I think TikTok is quite quick with moderating posts. If something bad gets posted, it's quite quick to take it down, but others like Instagram don't take it down as quick and it sort of stays online. But I think companies are more quick with it. Parents do try to get involved and help, but there's not much they can do other than yeah.
One of the things you said last time that I thought was really interesting was you thought, in a way, because what I see in my survey research very often as well is young people don't tell their parents or teachers. And you said something about how they kind of come in and take control and take over.
I think if a parent tries to take control really quickly, children feel patronized, and you sort of don't feel like adults have trust in you to be able to deal with these kind of things. I think obviously I've encountered stuff that hasn't been too nice on social media, but that's one of the parts of experiencing life, is seeing stuff that you're not too happy with and knowing how to deal about it. And if parents are more understanding of social media and more accepting, then children would feel that they can go speak to them, because they know you won't get told off for being on your phone. But yeah.
And maybe then my last question is, I think you've kind of implicitly answered it, but maybe my last question is, so should the policymakers ban it? No social media for under 16s, as they're debating in lots of countries?
I may have a biased opinion, but I strongly disagree. I
Right.
think it is also a main form of communication that we use. That is where children communicate, and it does also help us with the education. I remember before my exams, I would watch videos online. Just teachers also post TikToks explaining all our exams, what to know for chemistry, and I was watching that right before my exams in the morning, and I thought, yeah, it's more than just watching it for no reason.
Something we should remember when we're told kids are just on TikTok, like they're wasting their lives. Yes. Brilliant. Thank you so much indeed. Thank you. Brilliant. So how much longer do I have? Okay, cool. All right. So so thank you. So I thought we should just think a little bit about who is listening to young people when they share their experiences and offer their views and answer our adult questions. I hope not adultist, but adult questions. And remembering, you know, the kind of the controversy about Article 12 and how hard it is to build spaces where young people can come and express their views. So one of the, I've just put up one of the blog posts that we developed, we posted last week, which is to try to distinguish two things that I think often get confused, which one of which is young people, consulting young people about the digital environment, which is what the conversation we just had. And then there's also consulting young people through the digital environment, like using digital tools to talk about a whole host of other things. And I think there's a lot of that happening that isn't necessary. Well, all of it isn't always rights respecting, but they are kind of different. They are different goals. And with both of those in mind, we built a toolkit, which I'm hoping you can see up there, which is called Your Rights Online. And when we started building a toolkit to explain to young people what their rights are online, we were sort of staggered how hard it was actually to find resources. and we've been working on it with the global youth ambassadors who tell us they want it to be more whizzy and more videos and more languages and more for younger children. So I think there's actually a real kind of demand to understand better, but not so much practice as yet. But we will develop it. So I thought I'd just kind of pan back a little bit and think, okay, so who else is listening to what young people say, and particularly tell you about a project that I've been doing with my colleague, Dr. Kim Silvander, who is sitting here with me today, which is thinking about how the Committee on the Rights of the Child is using General Comment 25 and kind of drawing on what they hear from the voices of children, and especially how they are then taking General Comment 25 insofar as they are out into wider spaces, and especially debating it with states. So Kim has read all the concluding observations, 63, published since the General Comment 25 came out, and found, I'm wondering if I should bring you up here now, but anyway, I'll people can talk after, and found that the committee is talking about the digital environment in most of its conversations with states, and explicitly referencing General Comment 25 in 6 out of 10 of its concluding observations, which is interesting, and on a whole range of issues. From the right to privacy or right to accessing information, digital literacy, protection from harmful content, training and resources for professionals, regulations, monitoring, safeguards, codes, digital inclusion, and so on. So it's like a really kind of broad array of issues that really matter that the committee, I was actually quite heartened by this research, discovered, yes, they passed it. We asked them afterwards, what do you do when a general comment's out? And they said, we have no time, we have no money, we have no resources. It's like, but actually, no, they are taking it out. They are doing something with it. They don't ask so much. The research shows about some of the rights. So they don't ask so much about children's civil rights and freedoms, or their cultural rights, or their right to play, or their freedom of expression. And so we're kind of thinking now, are there ways in which that could be improved? Like what would be the kind of killer questions that we could say, ask some of these? Not so much either on reparation or remedy for children who have been harmed. And I think actually that kind of remains quite a challenge. And what we're doing now with that research, and I won't say so much, is tracing then, once things are raised with the countries, or perhaps others are raising things with the states also, what are they then doing? What are the ways in which specific regulations or specific laws are beginning to kind of emerge in different countries around the world? And how far does that begin to capture or improve the circumstances for children and realizing their rights in relation to the digital environment? So I think where I'm kind of trying to take you on my journey is, forgive me for a random slide. This is a slide that just says, I think what we need is a theory of change. And we've been kind of trying to think about, or we're beginning to think what that might mean. So this is what happens if you put theory of change into Google Images. So it's just, I can see that what we need is something complicated and pretty, and it has a flow and it has lots of parts. And so the question then is, okay, what are all the parts and what is the flow, and who are the key actors, and where is the kind of agency, and how do we make something that seems so very niche, like children's rights in the digital environment, but once you start unpacking it, you realize it matters actually for many areas of society, both because children are everywhere and much of what happens impacts children, and also because the digital is everywhere and it's increasingly becoming the infrastructure. And it's not only becoming the infrastructure, it's becoming a commercial infrastructure, a globalized infrastructure, a largely unaccountable infrastructure, especially for smaller states. And in this present moment, it's becoming quite a problematic infrastructure, which I know many governments are really struggling with. So I'm just thinking now as I make closing remarks. I realised at a certain point in preparing this talk that I'd said children's rights apply online as offline. Of course, I haven't said anything about how they apply offline. And that's not such a happy story either. So it's not like, you know, we've sorted offline and now how are we going to do online? But I do think there are some interesting ways in which there are new opportunities as we try to pursue children's rights online, or let's say in a digital world, because what happens online affects everyone, and children are people in both spaces. And how do we avoid some of the wrongs? So as you'll know, the history of children's rights is littered with wrongs being done to children. And we can see some of the ways in which that is also happening online or in relation to the online. And particularly, to go back to a point I made earlier about new audiences, we've been thinking a lot in our centre about the new audiences that we need to reach, because it's not just child rights folk, but all the people who build the technology, the designers, the developers, the marketers, the engineers, and so on. And what they talk about is design. And so my last slide and my last word is to say that where a lot of our work is kind of beginning to take us is to think, how do we address the systemic changes that would enact for children privacy by design, safety by design. People are talking now about digital literacy by design and well-being by design and so forth. So my last slide, I hope, is obvious, which is what we need is child rights by design. And we came to the 11 principles that I've put up here for child rights by design by kind of scrunching all the articles in the convention into a smaller number, because designers said we can't do all those articles, and then all the paragraphs and provisions in the general comments. So it's a kind of mapping. Anyway, it was a mapping exercise. The idea was to try to have something that could go on the design studio wall, or that the engineer might find accessible. They said, don't tell us what to do, tell us the question we need to have in our minds. You know, what do you know of building digital products? But you could ask some provocative questions. So we've built a model of children's rights by design with some provocative questions, and I have no idea if it will help, but it does seem to be a new audience, a new way of reaching out, perhaps a bit under the radar of some of the terrible things happening from on high. Maybe we go horizontal. Thank you very much.
My goodness, what an amazing tour de force. I'm just going to try to capture a few things. It was marvelous. I mean, certainly, I think everyone in this room would agree. Do you want to sit down, Sonia? And after that fantastic presentation, you know, we're certainly seeing a big moment for human rights for all the wrong reasons, bluntly. And I think one of the things that you might want to think about a little bit is the fact that human rights has been very exciting, but it's never captured non-state actors properly. And in fact, when we look at the pressures now, it's corporations, it's businesses, it's non-state actors are the key actors here. Really interesting about the ambivalence towards child rights amongst the human rights and digital rights field. Because of this perception of the children's rights are all about protection, and that, you know, ignoring the agency autonomy side. And then also it's interesting that point you made about best interests, because, you know, and also this notion of how, which is very much a protectionist standard and very limiting and constraining in terms of how we think about children's rights in the digital space. And I mention that because when Anne Skelton gave our lecture, one of her major concerns was about the fact people equating children's rights with best interests. But then, of course, we get on to Net Choice, who don't even like best interests. So, you know, what do we do then? Really appreciated the points in the child rights approach, which I'm sure people will come back to in this development of tools. And I think the way in which talking about the child rights approach, and obviously the convention is wonderful and General Comment 25 is wonderful, but the key thing is how the committee uses it, and wonderful it's being used, but then how do we tackle blind spots? You know, and I know there are people in this audience who have very much thought about how do we engage with those blind spots, particularly around freedom of expression and civil and political rights. This notion of a theory of change and the shortcomings of digital infrastructure, globalistic commercial, legal, largely unaccountable and problematic. I mean, I don't think anyone would disagree, but it's very helpful to have it presented in that way. But then, frankly, you did end positively and with hope, because you are talking about this new audience and this fantastic child rights by design for an audience that has thought really carefully about other things by design, as you highlight. There is potential there, and having these conversations. So thank you so much. And also to Nicole for, her fantastic insights with regards to, and I've managed to misplace my pieces of paper, but, very much focused on the positive potential of, not viewing TikTok as potentially harmful or potentially undermining, the notion of it as an opportunity by which people can have curated information, they can share and engage in shared experiences with their friends, the notion of the benefits of TikTok is, but I know that you're talking about social media more generally, getting news, getting, educational information, but also the issue of risks and how do we effectively manage those risks? Is it through the companies? And it's really interesting that you talk about companies and we talk about parents, but traditionally when we talk about children's rights and risks, we talk about states and governments. So for me, it was really interesting, Nicole, to hear how when we think about the digital, that just isn't where we go. We don't think about government regulation necessarily. So thank you both so much. That was like a terrible whistle-stop effort at synopsizing some of the issues. And I'd now like to ask our panel, if that's okay. We have this fantastic panel to join us up here to give their views. So if I can get Leo and Jen and Tracy to come up, and we have Kay online, that would be marvelous. Leo, do you want to come here? And we'll just... Okay, so I think we're going to start with now with first of our panelists, and I am delighted, both personally and professionally, because he is an old friend, to introduce and to welcome Leo Rathledge. You'll know, many of you will know Leo. He's co-director of the Child Rights International Network, which has done really groundbreaking work in this area around issues from AI to digital rights to encryption. And Leo leads on the legal and policy work within CRIN and is jointly responsible for the organization's strategy and direction. And I think, Leo, everyone has the bios online, so I'm going to keep that short, but I would love to hear your thoughts and response to what Sonia said just now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I was wondering how I was going to respond to Sonia, and there was a bit of me that was tempted to dig into something quite niche and technical, something that we're struggling with at the moment. But actually, I thought what might be more useful was to dig in a little more around this idea of what are the elements of a child rights response to the emerging issues that we're seeing in the digital world. Particularly bearing in mind that we're no longer really in a place where there's such a thing as a separate online world. It interacts absolutely and in every way with every other element of life. So we can't talk about them as if they're two separate things. So with that in mind, I came up with 4. We'll see if it's still 4 by the end. Elements that I think are really important when we're talking about what does a children's rights approach look like. And I think the first thing that came out really strongly from Sonia's presentation is that we have to recognize that we're talking about all of children's rights. Everything from protection from sexual violence, privacy for expression, association, adequate standing of living, right to health. We often see economic, social, cultural rights neglected in this space. And if we take the Convention on the Rights of the Child as an agreed international framework there, I think in some ways it addresses some of the questions that Sonia was raising around solidarity across movements, because we see a framework there that has the civil and political alongside the social, economic and cultural, and often with almost identical language that exists across other human rights treaties. So we have this comparable position from which we can start and build solidarity across those movements. And again, we have this recognition that all of these rights are interconnected, mutually supportive, and in some ways that can help us push back against the tensions. Is this a protection issue? Is this an expression issue? And it lets us deal with those tensions, I think, in a helpful way. And when it comes to new digital legislation, we've seen some examples. Sonia raises the examples of bringing in best interests through new tech regulation. We've seen that a lot in data protection regulation. Brazil, Kenya, quite good examples of how that's been done around best interests. The online safety legislation in Australia also deals with placing a remit on the Safety Commissioner to have regard to the CRC as a whole, which is unusual. But what we largely see is this focus on best interests, and it's a problematic focus on best interests. It's fine as far as it goes. I have no issue with legislation recognizing, protecting, setting up processes to analyze best interests in its appropriate place. But where it's standing in for all children's rights, it's a real problem because it forces a focus away from specific issues, and it also can lead us to quite a paternalistic attitude to what children's rights can mean. The second element, oh no, actually, just before I move on, a slightly more interesting phenomenon that we're starting to see around addressing all rights is the way that child rights impact assessments are starting to be developed in some policy processes. And by their nature, these force us to look at the complex, nuanced interrelationships of all rights. So just by introducing that as a procedural element, I think can really help us have a better conversation around how all children's rights are applied to a given issue. The second is around seeing interventions within the broader ecosystem. And I think it's quite easy to be drawn into specific new phenomena, whether that's a new trend on social media or whether it's something that exists structurally in the digital space, like encryption. But if we look at these issues in isolation, I think it can stop us seeing the complexity. So to take an example, if we look at responses to preventing sexual abuse online, if we only talk about social media regulation, then we're only going to be able to deal with parts of the picture, because it also means needing a fully functional social service, child protection service. Professionals working with children need to have proper training. We need specialist law enforcement processes. And I think we need to recognize that in the UK, these services have been badly damaged by austerity, that it's in many ways preventing us from dealing with the complexity of these issues in the way that we need to. The third, and I suspect I'm preaching to an already converted audience here, is that children need to be involved. And for that to be done in a rights respecting way, children need to be involved from a real variety of backgrounds. We can't assume that every child's experience is going to be the same. We still see, despite the explosion of wonderful research around this issue, lots of neglected communities. I see very little on the impacts for children with disabilities, even still with LGBT plus children involved in political movements. And if we're going to properly address this, we need to be talking to all of those perspectives and experiences as well. The fourth is, what's the impact globally? It's a cliche to say that the world's more interconnected, but like most cliches, it's true. And we have to be aware that when we're talking about regulation in one space, particularly when we're regulating practices or bodies that act across borders, we have unexpected impacts in other places. The experiences of children are not the same in countries where access to the internet is still the biggest challenge, and the experiences of children of social media are not the same in the UK as they are in countries under repressive regimes. So when we're talking about these issues, we need to look beyond our borders and think about what the unexpected impacts might be. I think I'm running out of time, so I'm going to wrap up. And I wanted to come back to the question of the event, which is children's rights apply online as offline. And in some ways it invites quite a glib response. Yes, of course they do. But behind that glib response is, it's far more complicated than that. There's an awful lot of nuance. There's so many intricacies that will defy us giving simple answers to what the best application, the true application of children's rights is. Thank you.
Wonderful. Marvelous. Thank you so much, Leah. No, that's fantastic. I mean, 4 key points, all of children's rights, seeing interventions in a broader ecosystem, involving children, local, global, not local, and it's complicated. I mean, brilliantly presented. I'm now going to hand over to our online colleague who's joining us, Kay. It's such a pleasure to have you here. And Kay Firth Butterfield is the CEO of Good Tech Advisory. And she is also an associate tenant based here at Doughty Street Chambers, about which we are completely delighted. Kay has about 90 different awards. She is the Time 100. She is a Time 100 Impact Awardee of 2024, a Who's Who Emerging Innovator of 2024, and Who's in America, Forbes 50 over 50. I think she'll speak of, you know, she was the inaugural and former head of AI and member of the executive committee of the World Economic Forum, and in 2014 became the world's first chief AI ethics officer. And she's we're delighted to have her here because she is one of the foremost experts in the world on the governance of AI. So Kay, if you can distill your extraordinary experience down to 5 minutes, that would be fantastic. But thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much for inviting me. And I'm actually sitting in one of the tech towns of the United States. Austin is my home at the moment. But Vermont will be my home next month. So I want to start with something that some friends of mine, Tristan Harris and Asa Raskin, who run the Center for Humane Tech, said not so long ago when we started talking about generative AI. We didn't get our interaction with AI the first time right. That's social media. And so we have no basis for getting our interaction as human beings with generative AI right. And I think that, you know, Sonia opened her talk saying digital's not optional. I agree with that, but I actually do think that the hype is optional. We need to cut through the hype and actually think as human beings what we want to take of the hype and what we don't want to take of the hype. We should note that the people who are hyping it are the people who have invested many billions of dollars in generative AI. And I'm going to talk about generative AI as it applies to children. So my first thing is to really talk about, let's look at this. There are about 300 million people using OpenAI around the world, but there are still, as the previous speaker said, 3 billion people thereabouts who are not connected to the internet. So this is not a wave of digital ability around the world. In fact, what it is an instance of us dividing our world even more. And of course, that affects the children around the world. The second thing I wanted to say was about data. Because we have 3 billion people who have not given their data to generative AI, whenever we use large language models, we are using biased data. We're using data that has been provided generally by white men in the global north because they've had the pen longest. I'll just take you back to when Jane Austen wrote Persuasion, and Anne Elliot was talking about, was having a debate about whether women or men love longest. And the man in the debate said to her, well, all the books say that men love longest. And Anne Elliot back in 1812 said, yes, but all the books were written by men. And that's still true of our interaction with AI today. Most of the books, men just had the pen for longer. Women's rights, children's rights, persons of color rights, all of the things that we have put into the internet are lesser. And why is that really important for kids? Well, it's important for kids because they have to learn that when they're using these tools, there is this automatic bias, and what they are getting out of the algorithm might not actually be any good to them at all. But it's also important because of something that we call cannibalism. Cannibalism is the way that the large language model eats the data that it has or that it's produced in answers. So to break it down easily, you ask the LLM a question, it gives you an answer that may or may not be true. We know about hallucinations and how difficult they are. And then that answer goes back into the data that the LLM will answer from in the future. It is anticipated that by the middle of this year, though the AI will be creating more data than all of us humans who are using it. It's really important that we think about some of these very big picture issues around data, around AI, when we're thinking about children's rights, because this is their future. And at the moment, if we don't think carefully about AI cannibalism, which of course embeds our previous data into our future, then what future are we actually giving to our children? I wanted to pick up just something that Nicole said, and none of us want to be manipulated or nudged by AI, but all of us who use social media are. And so I think there's a great importance in training children and helping children to understand how to use AI and how to use it wisely, how to use it in their private lives, but also how to use it as they are in school and beyond as employees, all of whom will probably be working with some form of AI, be it an AI agent, autonomous AI agent, or as their helpmate. So education around the tools that they're going to be using online and in their work is just so important. So I'm currently writing a book called Coexisting, and it's a guide to working and living and loving with AI. And I wanted to just talk to you about two chapters. So one is the 0 to 7s, and the other is the 8s to 22s. And I want to particularly work on look at the 0 to 7s, because that, as we know, is when these children are building their attitudes, values, and beliefs that will stick with them for the rest of their lives. Parents are being encouraged by toys, smart toys, so AI-enabled toys for their kids in this age range. There are, to my mind, a number of troubling things in that, and I will just very quickly look at them. First of all, over 90%, over 95% of those toys come from China. We don't know what's happening with the data. We don't know, we do know that because they incorporate facial recognition and voice recognition, the data has to go back to base in order to train the model better to communicate with your child. So we do know that some of this data is going outside the country, and obviously different countries have different rules on that. We don't know whether that data is being monetized. Should we be monetized? Should we be allowing other people to monetize our children's data from so young? But even if all of that's been dealt with by your country, let's think about how a child might grieve from the loss of such a toy. A child might not want to socialize with other people with other children because they make her cry and the toy never does. What about attachment? You know, is it you as a parent, or is it the AI that's teaching some of those values to the child? Are we going to be giving these resources to our children in order for them to be AI nannies for example, and we're already seeing children with iPads.
Okay.
So, maybe this is the next step. But is that good for our children? And so,
I'm so sorry, but I might actually just ask you to very quickly bring it to a close.
Certainly.
And we can Q&A, but just thank you.
Yeah, certainly. So all of those questions could be also addressed in terms of children with disabilities. But so what I've done is try to give you a specific example or some specific examples of the problems that I think we have to overcome when we're thinking about children's rights. Because if we don't, I think our children's futures are pretty bleak.
Absolutely.
Sorry,
Listen, thank you. No, it was great. Thank you so much, Jay. Yeah. I mean, we'll move on to the next speaker, but I think this whole issue of the big picture issues around AI when thinking about how we manage the issue of children's rights and children's engagement with it is so important. And thank you for all the points you've made. I'm now going to very quickly turn to Jen Pearson, who is the founder of the not-for-profit organization Defend Digital Me. And she and her organization campaign for children's privacy and digital rights in the UK, state education system, and the wider public sector. So really important work here in the UK. Multiple reports and research outputs on topics like AI, biometrics, EU tech, data protection law. And Jen, in addition, is a current contributor to the Council of Europe Digital Citizenship Working Group on AI and Education, and supported the Committee of Convention 108 in the drafting of the Council of Europe guidelines for data protection in education settings. So thank you so much, Jen. And maybe you give us, some of your thoughts based on your very rich experience and expertise.
Thank you. Well, what terrific contributions we've had already. And I'm going to draw really mainly on Sonia's talk to start with, I think. So because rather than speak to AI or to speak to education, where Tracy will come as well, I really wanted to say in response to Sonia's keynote to expand on 3 points that I think are the domain of civil society and NGOs that we have the ability to do that perhaps charities sometimes cannot, which is to go more into the political. And I think it's, as Sonia said at the moment, a really key field that we have to see in this context, and how the political lens affects everything that we are doing at the moment, particularly in the context of language. So what resonated with me in Sonia's contribution was the language of rights. Where this overlaps with our own work is seeing this weaponization of the language of child rights. And I would ask that anyone working in the legal sector is acutely aware of it right now and pays attention to due diligence above all of where this comes from. So sometimes it feels like conversations about children's rights is more about what adults think is right for children. And I think we see a challenge that's yet to be clarified in these boundaries between adults and children's rights at the moment. When it comes to the online environment, it can appear right now that we have voices from the right and the left across this old language of the political spectrum speaking united voices. But I'd suggest we have to pay close attention to these multiple voices that come in overlapping, what I would look at, multiple Venn diagrams at the moment, and to understand how the words of children's rights are being used and the values behind those words that may be being used with the voices that come to present through the words of children's rights, but that the wedge issues that they're actually talking about may not be all about all children's rights. So children's rights and human rights law, which includes the protection of the child, is one thing, but we're also seeing the promotion of rights and the participation rights left out when it comes to the child protection harms seen through a moral lens. I'd say one area in particular as a case study right now is the overlap of screen time debate and the prevention of children accessing content. Now, if we look across the pond and look at the US, we often see the same debate tied very closely, but not always, and I say that very carefully, that to a subgroup of particular interests, which is the evangelical Christian rights voice to wanting to prevent children's access to information online. It comes with a particular flavor, which is preventing access to LGBTQ information, to topics around identity, reproductive rights, or sexual health. And we see this coming into the political debates across here in the UK as well in the media. Now, it may not be first apparent, but some of these groups do have overlapping interests and overlapping interactions. And we would sometimes want people to challenge things like where the funding and the media interests and the overlaps come from. So second is the stretching of the best interests principle. We've talked about that, both Sonia and Leo spoke to that very well, perhaps being more familiar from the sort of immigration law, family law perspectives. I think we are yet to see how that plays out when it comes to big tech. And the case study I have here is taken from there was drafting for the Safer Phones bill that did not pass through last week in debate in Parliament, but that sought to bring in a clause that would enable civil action, collective action, to be able to defend children's rights, in particular in the context of age assurance or age verification failures by big tech. Now, where we have vagueness in the law at the moment around what is the best interest of the child, what are reasonable endeavours to protect the best interest of the child, where is the best interest of your particular child versus the assessment that big tech may have done as an aggregated collective right going to be measured, and how is that upheld in court? I think we have yet to see challenged, but it is a very real debate that's going on behind the scenes. Even if it did not pass into the actual drafting of that law, it was on paper at one point, and so it's very much in debate. Where we do see the overlap of these rights in law and where it has been upheld is, of course, education law, looking at Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 26, the right to the parent and the child overlapping in the right to education. Where we see it particularly challenged right now in the UK is the emerging the Children's and Wellbeing in Schools Bill, where all children's who are not in schools data is going to be extracted to the national level, to the Department for Education, without consent, without any objection or process, and whether that will follow the same model as current national pupil database usage or not, we are yet to see. Where it might also still be challenged is in the consent or pay models around ad tech, and that sort of idea of what is consent. Can parents consent on behalf of a child? No. Where can they? When can they? At what age? We might want to talk about that further, and where we might see that challenged as again, models are being debated, and we saw it in the press today, as Sonia mentioned, around the age of Article 8 of GDPR being changed, and whether that might be raised, again, without any sort of evidence base. So that would be where I'd wrap up. And the last point, just on what Leo mentioned around children being involved, again, thinking very carefully about how that's going to look. For example, where the Department of Education has plans to extract children's content and data for AI tech development, and how they might want to manage IP rights and how parents or children would manage that, whether this is permissions or consents, and how that's going to look in copyright law might be another area.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much, Jen. And I mean, I think this huge issue you raise, this weaponization of children's rights for different agendas. Are we talking adults' rights or children's rights? Which children's rights are we talking about is so important. And the way in which, again, you raise the issue of involvement. Again, we talk about the issue of stretching of the best interest principle, and the challenges around particular frameworks and the way in which they engage with children and their data. I'm going to turn now to our final speaker. I'm conscious that people may, due to my appalling chairing, be anxious there will be no Q&A. So what I'm going to do is slightly abuse, and if people have to leave at 7, they have to leave at 7, but my plan otherwise is to go on till about 7:15 to ensure we have Q&A. But as I say, if you have to go, you have to go. But I apologise, and it is entirely my fault, but I do not want to cut Tracy short. So Tracy, please, it would be wonderful to hear your thoughts here. Tracy's the co-founder of Data, Tech and Black Communities, which is a community-based organisation dedicated to ensuring that data and data-driven technologies enhance Black communities rather than curtailing or surveilling them. And she spent over 20 years researching and developing supportive mechanisms to enable communities and not-for-profit organisations to ethically and legally use data to support people to live and thrive. She's also a trustee of Access Social Care and a board member of Open Data Manchester. And she previously held leadership roles as Deputy Chief Executive of 360 Giving, which many of us will be familiar with, and as Community Data Principal at the Legal Education Foundation. So Tracy, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. And a real privilege to be on this panel. I am not an expert in children's rights. I'm going to talk pivot a little bit to speak more about, sorry, I didn't switch on. about some of the work that we've done and kind of ground it in that, and especially the role of parents in being stewards of children's data, but also in teaching, and not just parents, teachers and educators, about how do children learn about their children's rights as well, and the role of understanding we need to build in that. So Data Tech and Black Communities, we're a small community organisation. It was dreamed up by myself and 2 other Black women who worked in and around the data and AI industry. And we became increasingly concerned about the stories coming out of the tech industry of the unintended consequences that occurred within machine learning and AI projects, of which Kay has mentioned some of these already, such as stories of facial recognition technologies that struggle to detect Black faces or specifically darker skins. It was kind of surfaced by researchers in the US. We saw again in COVID with devices like the pulse oximeter, which is to measure oxygen, again, in the midst of COVID, not detecting Black skins in terms of oxygen levels, like really important things. And so, you know, we were concerned about, you know, the fact that data-driven technologies are developed and they're not factoring in the impacts of all potential users, resulting in this unintended consequences. And specifically, we saw that this occurred in Black communities, marginalized communities, vulnerable communities. Leo's mentioned about LGBTQ communities as well. So that need to kind of think really holistically about who is impacted by these technologies. So in our spare time, we raise awareness within Black communities of data-driven technologies and encourage people to scrutinize, question, and we support to do that. So we're in the final stages of a community-driven project that took place in Birmingham, where we supported 10 people to become community researchers, which across the project meant we engaged with over 200 predominantly Black heritage people. Our researchers were just ordinary people, Brummie citizens, that responded to our call to investigate whether educational technologies and apps, EdTech for short, that were used in schools, did they actually improve the outcomes on Black children? It's a big push by government to get these into schools, but do they actually work? And for many, there was an understanding of how the UK education system had been discriminatory towards Black children. And just today, I read in The Guardian of the MP Kim Johnson calling for a public inquiry to account for the harm that occurred in the 60s and 70s when many Black children were labelled as educationally subnormal and sent to special educational schools, which when that policy was scrapped, precipitated the escalation of Black children being excluded from schools and sent to pupil referral units, which an outcome that still lingers today. So this is why questioning the use and impact of data-driven technologies placed onto existing social systems is needed. It's very much what Kay has mentioned, and why we need the importance of us understanding our rights, the importance of children and young people understanding their digital rights, which Sonia spoke about today. So within this background in mind, I consider tonight's topic on the challenges of implementing children's rights in the digital environment. And our project focused on adults in the role of stewards of children's data rather than children directly. It's something I would like to do, but it's not to minimize that. That is really important too. But a key challenge we experienced across the parents and guardians, school staff and community leaders we spoke with was in recognizing that there was a problem of children's data potentially being commercially exploited, children being targeted with adverts, their data being potentially leaked, their data potentially used for additional surveillance, and also that they had the power to stop or perhaps even minimize some of these problems. There's the other question of, as we mentioned, about whether it actually works. And if it did work, the big if it does work, very little evidence to say whether it does, the access to digital devices and internet data that enables all children to be able to participate if it did work. So in speaking to parents and non-senior management team within schools, we came across a halo effect where if the school was generally trusted, it was presumed that digital tools and apps that schools introduced were also to be trusted and were safe. So in our parents and guardians questionnaires that we did, over half did not feel able or were uncertain on how to exercise their rights and make use of legislative protections to get the information they needed to assess if EdTech providers were able to support their children's learning and keep their data safe. In a community event we held, we observed that while most people knew of GDPR, they'd heard about it, they kind of understood, No one had heard of the age-appropriate design code or considered other rights which can be used to support children to live happy lives in our digital age. So a key challenge we have is to support the people who have the role of helping children to learn about their digital rights. And having previously worked at a grant-making foundation in the access to justice space, this recommendation is really not new, that people need to know and understand their rights, but nevertheless is still needed. So at events we've held, we've received requests from, for support from parents and guardians and school staff on what are our rights, infants, like students, and how we can use them so that they can be better stewards and educators for their children with their data and the use of technologies. And I'm really glad to be sat next to Jen because unfortunately I've been able to pick her brains and work with her in terms of developing toolkits, which Sonia has also mentioned about the need for developing accessible toolkits that people can use and plays good guidance. So to conclude with a final challenge, that despite the power that big tech holds over our society, in which you kind of started off the session, that we don't give up hope, we don't feel too despondent. We do have rights and we have legal protections, much of which were hard fought over, much of which we still have to continue fighting over. Think about the scrutiny just of the data use and access bill that's taking place. We need to keep on fighting. And then, of course, there are bills and protections that we actually need to create. So with all of this, sitting here in Doughty Street Chambers amongst barristers and lawyers, all I can say and ask is that we make it our duty to share the knowledge we have with others, so as to increase the groundswell of voices championing children's data and digital rights. And we do that in accessible and understandable ways.
Wonderful. And I mean, you know, I think it was that was a beautiful way to end the interventions. I might actually, Tracy, get you to turn off your microphone if you don't mind, but it's, I just think this whole idea of risks of data being placed onto existing social systems is, you know, I'm thinking as a massively important one that ties in, as you said, with what Kay was saying, this theme of commercial exploitation of data, the fact that the protections exist, but how do those who are meant to be supporting children around them access them, but also finalizing the fact that we do have these protections. There are rights, they're not perfect, we have to build on them, we have to fight for them, but you know, we have a basis and we can move forward on that front. So thank you so much, Tracy. Thank you so much to the panelists and to Sonia. Now, what I would propose to do is I'm going to take a round of questions. I would ask people, I'm going to take a number of them together. Can you identify yourself? And can you keep your questions and comments relatively short? Okay, just to try to get around the maximum of people. So let me start. Any questions? Okay, gentleman in the woolly jumper.
Thank you.
Can you introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Tyler Liskowicz. I'm a student of law at UCL. I had a question sort of combining two of the points, one from Ms. Pearson and one from Professor Livingstone, on politics and online spaces. Specifically, with reference to human rights and children's rights in online spaces, we talk a lot about the over-politicization of it, or even the political corruption of it, using online spaces as a way to enter political ideologies in less than pleasant ways to children, or to, in other words, indoctrinate them. And this sort of gets at what Nicole was talking about earlier. I was just curious as to panelists' opinions on how to best combat that, or even on a policy or an individual level. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that question, much appreciated. Any other questions? I'm going to take a few in a row. Person further, second from the back.
Hi there, Annie Francis, a solicitor at Miles and Partners. I want to believe in the positivity of social media and the digital world, as Nicole has touched on. But I represent children directly or through their guardians. I'm terrified, I'm overwhelmed. I know TikTok is being used for sending, for example, Tracy touched on this as well in what she shared, gang warfare messages, we've got sexting, we've got cyberbullying. What can we do immediately? What do you need us to do to start to campaign for change? Do we need better education for parents, for children? And where can we start?
So much, Annie. Very, very helpful. Other questions at this point? Okay, I'm suggesting that I'm taking that as a ringing endorsement of everything that everyone has said. Thank you so much for that. So I'm going to start with a question that I'm going to direct first to Sonia. This issue of how do we control the question of how do we combat political indoctrination of children in digital spaces? Do you want to respond to that, Sonia?
Difficult question. A question that seemed easier a few months ago when we had fact checkers operating and curbing. I think the Centre for Countering Digital Hate has said hate is already going up and they expect a whole lot more as the fact checkers step back. And I don't know that we'd kind of properly identified, we've talked about fact checkers as dealing with misinformation or disinformation, but actually they're dealing with a whole spectrum of content that is happening online that is now unchecked. So in a way we know the solution, but we're not doing it. So what is the way of insisting? I think the second question that I think we're really struggling with is not merely the content, but the idea that there are also the systems that are amplifying certain kinds of content, and not only amplifying it to everyone, perhaps when something blows up, but targeting it at certain people and so the platforms use the data they have to know where to target, where to identify vulnerabilities. And then I'm very conscious, we have very different feeds. My feed is, as I keep saying, full of kittens and bunnies, and other people's feed is full of hate. And it makes it very hard for us even to know what is happening. So what can we do? I think there's a lot of frustration with the Online Safety Act's implementation. Parliament is clearly debating hard. I'm exercised by what lawyers can do. So one thing I've often heard it said, I don't know if it's true, is there aren't enough cases that really kind of challenge big tech because they always kind of settle out of court. And so there isn't that case history of successful wins that you might expect to see in other areas. I don't know how to overcome it.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Sonia. And actually, I might shamelessly take that question of what can lawyers do and throw it over to Kay, building on the work that she's done. She might have thoughts. But for the moment, I'm going to turn to see if, Jen, if there's something you want to add with regards to the combating the political indoctrination of children online.
So Sonia's spoken to the Online Safety Act, so I'll leave that part aside. I think I'm wearing, although I'm not representing the Council of Europe AI and Digital Citizenship group, as AI and Education Digital Citizenship group, we're working at the moment on a work of a recommendation around digital literacy around AI and education, particularly to speak to this point, recognizing the importance of understanding the digital environment through all of the fields in which information is understood and accessible, and that is enhanced or exacerbated through the use of AI, but it is not only about that. And we are very conscious of who informs what is in that content. So whether at the moment you are looking, for example, at the US cutting its education department significantly, that's an understatement, and whether climate and sustainability or diversity education as part of your education curriculum is going to be really significant. And that goes beyond the digital environment. It goes beyond human rights values that uphold the rule of law and democracy. And we would look to the UK at the legal challenge at the moment being brought against Bridget Phillipson and the Department for Education on the Higher Education and Freedom of Speech Act, where it is debatable, depending on which aspect you sit on this political spectrum you sit on this, whether that is a Freedom of Speech Act or whether it is about the control of speech. And that is, I think, something that we need greater teaching to start with in teacher training around literacy, digital skills and data to inform the whole of the process that actually ends up with informing democracy and freedom to make wise decisions about the knowledge that you receive.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jen. And actually, I think that in a way slides into the second question that Annie was talking about, what can we do to campaign for change? You talk about the emphasis in the education system and focusing there. But Tracy, I was wondering if you wanted to address what Annie had raised in her question.
First off, I just wanted to acknowledge, Annie, it does feel like a bit of an onslaught that's taking place. Of like, how do you keep up with this? How do you, but also as well, the importance of speaking with your children about this. I speak with my son about all of this, and like, you know, you hear things like Andrew Tate and the kind of conversations that boys are online are having. It's not just Andrew Tate, it's like everywhere. It's like sports and football and all these type of things. But I think the key thing is, it really is like, speak with your kids, learn about the rights that we have. It's not just like what Kay will say. It's not inevitable that all of this has to happen, that we have to be switched on all the time. We have to engage with all digital products all the time. We can say no, we can say stop. We can try and find out like what information is being collected about us to feed what, to where. We have to ask these questions, and it feels tiring, like, oh, I'm a parent, I've got so many other things. It's like not fair for parents having to do this. And I think this is where the panel has spoken already about the need for a better regulation and the things that we have to do, so that the burden doesn't fall on parents and guardians and school staff to do this. But in the meantime, we've got to have the parents and guardians and school staff providing that groundswell of like, we need support. It just cannot carry on unrelenting. So the things like developing like the toolkits and explainable, understandable ways, we're finding that parents that came to our events just don't know, like, where do we start? And I found it hard to kind of pinpoint, like, where do I find accessible information to defend digital? Me, some great stuff, by the way.
Very good job. That's marvelous. I mean, I love a bit of, you know, what's the expression, log rolling for each other. That's what these events are all about. Listen, Leo, I wonder if there's anything you want to add there before I turn to Kay to get her to talk about what the lawyers can do. Maybe you want to talk about what the lawyers can do as well.
Maybe. I think in some ways I'd like to reply to your question a little bit, because I think it's the bit that really struck me is what can we do immediately? And I think one of the struggles is it's in some ways dealing with.
Yeah, there's too many on, I think. Right, let's try.
Is that better? Perfect. I think in some ways one of the challenges is much like climate change. There are so many different factors going on that you can't address them all. Nobody can address them all. And in some ways that's frustrating, but it's also quite liberating, I think, in that it opens up the freedom to pick the bits that you are connected to. So we absolutely need a better regulatory response, but we also need to deal with enforcement. I'm looking to Kay, who may want to talk a little bit about that. We need better digital literacy. We need better political literacy. And all of these entry points, I think, are kind of invitations for people to lean on their own skills. If you're working at parents group and you want your school to do better around digital literacy, there's a campaign around that. If you're unhappy with the way your children's data is being used, there's a campaign around that. And I think that in some ways that gives us entry points that could apply for all of us.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Leo. And I'm going to turn over to Kay now. I mean, I very unfairly said, what can the lawyers do? And then Leo said, oh, Kay will want to talk about regulation as well. So, I mean, Kay, what would you like to talk about?
Well, probably all of the above. I guess that, first of all, I'd like to point out that there was a study done in May by Oxford University, Reuters, and the BBC that actually said that 42% of people in the UK had not heard of ChatGPT, let alone any of the other LLMs. If that's true, and obviously, you know, that's nearly a year old now, and that figure might have come down, but we need to understand that that's where a lot of parents are. It's actually where maybe some lawyers are, and some politicians. So how much you're using it and how well you're learning to use it, I think is number one thing. We really, as lawyers, we need to understand it. We need not to fear it. I know it's coming for our jobs if we're solicitors, but the more that we can encourage everybody to understand what AI is, what it isn't, what its dangers are, and what they aren't, the better we're going to be able to combat some of the things like, for example, the first question that was asked. I think we have to hold the government's feet to the fire a little bit about using some of this stuff in very dangerous circumstances. So, you know, we could talk about lethal autonomous weapons and what that could do for our children's future. But But basically, we've seen that, for example, in Australia, when the government did use it and got it wrong, lots of people lost their social security checks for 6 months odd. We saw something like that in Holland as well. So I think that although there is this push and pull about, it's good to use it, but it's only good to use it if you get it right. Those are some of the things that lawyers should be doing and we should be thinking about. AI invades all of our life, and so therefore it invades all of our legal systems. So whether you want to talk about children, or whether you want to talk about tort or contract or administrative law, it's there somewhere. And what I do think is that there are cases that are coming forward where we should be looking to litigate. And so you should, as lawyers, be on the lookout for that. And also, and as I say, to understand that the law exists. So the other day I was advising a company who were asking me if they were going to be sued because one of their employees had used ChatGPT to advise on the size of a valve. When it was installed, that valve had exploded and spread noxious substance all over the site and some human beings as well. So there are cases coming, and there are, even though it's lovely to have regulation, we have existing law. So just as companies need to self-regulate, so do we. We need to be looking for it.
Thank you so much, Kay. That's great. I am now, because we are shockingly over time, and we're not going to take more questions, but there are drinks at the back and there are snacks, and the speakers are staying around, apart from poor Kay, unfortunately, who can't be with us because she's in lovely Texas. So there will be opportunities to chat to the speakers. But before we finish, I want to hand over to the woman of the night, Sonia, to just give a 60-second, just in case there's anything else she wants to add.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your patience. So I had one thought to end on. So the universities are in a terrible state right now, and philosophy departments are having to close, and this is truly bad. But one thing I heard was that in trying to survive, philosophy departments find themselves even giving lectures on ethics to engineers. And even though I'm sorry they're pushed to that point, I was also glad. Yes, because engineers in this digital world need ethics too. And it kind of comes back also to Kay's point about people building noxious, need to understand the digital and its implications and its rights. So I think actually, I'll end where I ended my presentation. I think we have a lot of questions to ask, and we should be asking them to a lot of new audiences, because everyone is now dealing with this stuff and everyone is worried. Let's go out there and kind of just raise some difficult questions.
Listen, thank you so much. I think that's a brilliant note to end on. I just wanted, before we finish, I have to say a few thank yous. First of all, thanks to Emily and Shan and Ray and Camilla for their fantastic work around organizing this event. It would not have happened without them. Ditto Shu Shins. And thank you to our Children's Rights Group members who do such important work in relation to children's rights, who inspire us and of course serve as the basis for this kind of event. I want to thank all of you for coming for what I know is a really busy time of year. I want to thank our fantastic interveners, Nicole, Leo, Kay, who can't see me waving at her, Jen, Tracy. But finally, I want you to join hands with me and just say thank you so much again to Sonia for a really stimulating talk, and which has led to such a brilliant conversation. Thank you. And now grab a well-earned drink. Thank you all.